Martha kept a mental calendar of seasonal wind patterns, understanding that certain times of year brought predictable challenges to candle tending. The spring storms that marked winter's end were violent but brief, requiring intense protection. For short periods, summer's evening breezes were gentle but persistent, demanding different techniques of flame management. Autumn winds could be treacherous in their unpredictability, shifting direction without warning and catching the unwary with sudden gusts. The phases of the moon influenced wind patterns in ways that Martha had observed but could not fully explain. Certain lunar cycles seemed to bring calmer evenings when candle flames burned steadily with minimal protection. Other phases corresponded with restless nights when winds seemed to seek every possible way into their cottage, testing the limits of human skill and patience in maintaining light. The art of wind reading extended beyond mere observation to include preparation based on predictions that were never certain but often accurate enough to be useful. When signs pointed to a difficult night ahead, Martha would gather extra materials for flame protection, position screens and barriers in advance, and ensure that backup lighting sources were readily available if their primary candle failed, despite all precautions. The family had learned to work together in response to weather predictions, with each member taking responsibility for specific aspects of preparation. Thomas would check and secure the shutters that protected their windows from direct wind. William would ensure that doors and gaps were properly sealed against infiltrating air currents. Martha would arrange the cottage's interior to provide maximum protection for their candle while maintaining the lighting needed for evening activities. The accuracy of weather prediction improved with experience, but never reached certainty. Martha had learned to prepare for the worst while hoping for the best, understanding that over-preparation was preferable to being caught unprepared by conditions that could destroy hours of careful work in seconds. The cost of excessive caution was small compared to the price of losing their precious light to preventable causes. Sometimes the weather would surprise them with unexpected gentleness. Nights when feared storms failed to materialize or shifted direction to trouble other villages instead of theirs. These peaceful evenings were gifts to be treasured, opportunities to accomplish tasks that required steady light, while building reserves of materials and energy for the inevitable nights when nature would test their skills to the limit. But more often, Martha's predictions proved accurate enough to provide essential preparation time for the challenges ahead. The art of reading wind and weather had become second nature, as automatic as breathing and as essential as any skill their family possessed. In learning to anticipate nature's moods, she had gained the ability to protect their precious light against all but the most extreme conditions, ensuring that darkness would claim victory only when human skill and determination had been overwhelmed by forces too powerful to resist. As evening settled over Millbrook village and Martha completed her assessment of the night's likely challenges, she felt the familiar mixture of confidence and concern that came with weather knowledge. She could predict much of what lay ahead, but prediction was not control, and the wind would blow as it chose, regardless of human wishes or preparations. Her art lay not in commanding the weather, but in reading its intentions clearly enough to mount effective defenses against its assault on their precious flame. As the candle flame settled into its evening rhythm, finding balance between the gentle drafts that threatened to extinguish it and the steady airflow it needed to survive, the cottage walls came alive with shadows that seemed to breathe and move with lives of their own. These dancing forms were not mere optical effects, but companions in the nightly drama of keeping light alive, partners in the ancient human story of pushing back darkness through skill and determination. Martha watched the shadows with the attention of someone who had learned to read their language, understanding that the way they moved could reveal wind patterns invisible to other senses. When shadows flickered rapidly, it warned of gusty air that could threaten their candle without warning. When they swayed with steady rhythm, it indicated consistent drafts that could be defended against with proper positioning and protection. The walls themselves became instruments that displayed the cottage's invisible atmosphere. The stone and timber construction of their humble dwelling had been seasoned by decades of candlelight and firelight, its surfaces darkened and stained by smoke from countless flames. These ancient walls held memory of all the families who had sheltered here, all the candles that had burned in this space, all the battles fought against wind and weather to maintain light in the face of darkness. The shadows that danced there were part of a tradition stretching back through generations. Young Thomas found magic in the shadow play that unfolded each evening, his imagination transforming the moving shapes into stories that made the long night hours pass more quickly. A shadow cast by the candlestick became a castle tower where brave knights defended against attacking dragons. The flickering silhouette of his mother's hands became graceful birds flying across distant mountains. The interplay of light and darkness turned their simple cottage into a theater where wonders unfolded each night. The practical value of shadow reading went beyond entertainment to include essential information about their flame's condition and stability. Martha had learned to judge the candle's health by observing how its light interacted with surrounding objects. Steady shadows indicated a strong, well-fed flame. Erratic movement warned of wicks that needed trimming or drafts that required attention. The shadows were diagnostic tools that revealed problems before they became crises. The positioning of objects around their cottage had been arranged partly to create shadow patterns that would provide maximum information about air movement and flame condition. A feather suspended from the ceiling served as a sensitive indicator of the subtlest drafts, its shadow on the wall revealing air currents too gentle to feel but strong enough to threaten their candle. Small pieces of cloth and paper were positioned to cast shadows that would dance in response to dangerous air movement. William had learned to work by shadow light when necessary, his weathered hands capable of performing simple repairs and maintenance, tasks guided by the moving patterns on the wall rather than direct illumination. This skill had been developed through necessity during nights when the candle flame was too fragile to risk moving, or when their light source was positioned for protection rather than convenience. The children who had grown up in this cottage had all learned to navigate by shadow, understanding how the changing patterns of light and darkness marked the safe paths through their simple home. They could move from bed to door, from table to hearth, guided by familiar shadow landmarks that remained constant even as the candle flame that created them flickered and danced in response to air currents. The aesthetic beauty of the shadow dance was not lost on the family despite their practical concerns. Martha found genuine pleasure in the graceful patterns that played across their walls, the way ordinary objects were transformed into art by the interplay of flame and darkness. A simple wooden bowl became a landscape of hills and valleys. A hanging garment became a waterfall of flowing fabric. The shadows elevated their humble surroundings into something approaching elegance. Different types of candles created different shadow patterns, each with its own character and charm. Tallow candles, with their unsteady flames, produced nervous, energetic shadows that seemed to dance with excitement. Beeswax candles created more stable patterns, their steady light casting shadows that moved with graceful dignity. Rushlights flickered with rapid, almost frantic energy that made their shadows appear to vibrate with life. In the quiet village of Millbrook, where the river wound through meadows like a silver ribbon catching the last rays of autumn's sun, there lived a woman whose life was measured not in hours or days, but in the gentle rhythm of flames carefully tended and lovingly preserved. Martha stood in her small cottage as evening shadows lengthened across the stone floor, preparing for the nightly ritual that had defined her existence for 37 years. The delicate ceremony of bringing light into darkness. The candle. Before her was no mere stick of wax, but a precious thing crafted from months of patient labor. Each drop of tallow had been saved from the family's meager supply of meat, rendered slowly over low fires until it transformed from animal fat into something approaching the sacred. The wick, twisted from linen threads pulled from worn-out clothing, had been dipped and dried, until it reached the perfect thickness that would neither burn too quickly nor too slowly. Martha's fingers, stained with years of wax work and rough from countless tasks, moved with the precision of a master craftsman as she prepared to light the precious flame. The tinder box beside her held the compressed char cloth and steel striker that could coax sparks from flint. But even these tools required skill and patience that had been learned through necessity and refined through practice. In a world where fire meant the difference between warmth and cold, light and darkness, life and death, the simple act of lighting a candle carried weight beyond modern understanding. The cottage around her breathed with the accumulated smoke of countless fires, its wooden beams darkened by years of burning rushes, tallow candles, and the occasional luxury of beeswax when the village priest had been generous with his surplus. The walls themselves seemed to hold memory of all the flames that had flickered here, all the hands that had shielded precious light from drafts that crept through gaps in the stone and timber construction. Outside, the wind was beginning its evening song, whistling through the bare branches of the oak tree that had stood sentinel beside the cottage for longer than anyone could remember. Martha could feel the air moving through her home, seeking every crack and crevice where it might enter to challenge the flame she was about to create. The battle between light and darkness, between human will and natural force, was about to begin again. She struck the flint against steel, sending sparks dancing into the char cloth like tiny stars falling to earth. The ember caught, glowing red and patient, as she lifted it carefully to the prepared tinder. Her breath, controlled and gentle, coaxed the spark into flame, the small fire growing from nothing into something that could kindle the candle's wick. Each breath was calculated. Too little, and the flame would die. Too much, and it would flare and consume the precious materials too quickly. The moment when the candle caught was always magical, no matter how many times Martha had witnessed it. The wick accepted the flame with a small sigh, the wax beginning its slow transformation from solid to liquid, feeding the fire that would provide light for the precious hours ahead. The flame steadied, found its rhythm, began the ancient dance. That would continue until wind or want extinguished it again. But lighting the candle was only the beginning of the night's work. Martha knew that this fragile flame would face challenges that could defeat it at any moment. The wind that whispered outside would soon become a roar, seeking entry through every possible gap. The candle's own burning would create drafts that could disturb its flame. Even the movements of her family as they prepared for sleep could create air currents that might snuff out their precious light. Young Thomas, her son of 12 years, watched his mother's ritual with the attention of someone learning skills that would determine his own survival in years to come. He had already mastered the basic techniques of fire-making, but the subtle art of candle tending required understanding that went beyond mere mechanical skill. The boy was beginning to appreciate the delicate balance between protection and suffocation, the way air could be both enemy and friend to the fragile flame. Martha's husband William returned from his evening inspection of their animals, bringing with him a gust of cold air that made the candle flame dance wildly for a terrifying moment. Both mother and son held their breath, watching the flame bend and recover, straighten and settle back into its steady rhythm. The door was quickly closed, but the incident reminded them all how precarious their hold on light truly was. The time of night influenced the shadow patterns as much as the flame's condition, with evening shadows being gentler and more predictable than the restless movements that appeared as midnight approached and air currents grew more active. Martha had learned to read these temporal changes, understanding that shadow behavior could indicate not just current conditions, but probable developments in the hours ahead. The walls themselves contributed to the shadow patterns through their texture and construction. Rough stone surfaces created shadows with soft, indistinct edges that seemed to blend and merge like smoke. Smooth wooden boards produced sharper, more defined patterns that moved with crisp precision. The interplay between different surface textures created a complex landscape of light and shadow that changed constantly as the candle flame responded to shifting air currents. Martha had taught Thomas to use shadow patterns as tools for evening activities, understanding that direct candlelight was too precious to waste on tasks that could be accomplished with reflected and secondary illumination. The boy had learned to write his letters guided by the shadow of his hand on the slate, to sort materials by their shadow shapes, to perform simple tasks using the wall projections rather than direct flame light. The seasonal changes that affected wind patterns also influenced the character of their shadow dances. Spring shadows seemed to flutter with the energy of renewal and growth. Summer patterns moved with lazy contentment that reflected the season's abundance. Autumn shadows grew restless and urgent, as if sensing the approaching winter. The deep winter months brought shadow movements that seemed almost desperate in their intensity, reflecting the battle between light and the season's increasing darkness. The cottage's ancient walls had witnessed countless such shadow performances there, surfaces serving as screens for the nightly entertainment that unfolded wherever human beings gathered around flame. The patterns that moved across stone and timber were part of an eternal drama that connected Martha's family to every other family that had ever sought to keep light alive in the face of darkness and wind. As the evening progressed and the candle flame continued its brave burning, despite the challenges posed by air currents and weather, the shadows that danced on their walls seemed to celebrate each moment of survival, each successful defense against the forces that sought to extinguish their precious light. In their graceful movements, Martha saw reflected the beauty that could emerge from the simplest human activities when performed with skill and attention, the way necessity could be transformed into art through the patient application of love and care. The ancient walls that surrounded their small family held not just shadows, but stories, not just patterns of light and darkness, but memories of all who had sat in similar circumstances, tending similar flames, finding similar wonder in the dance of illumination that made human life possible in a world that might otherwise be ruled entirely by night. And as you watch these shadows dance in your own imagination, perhaps you too can find comfort in the knowledge that somewhere in the gentle movement of light across walls, humans have always found beauty in the most practical activities, magic in the most necessary tasks, and hope in the simple act of keeping light alive against all the forces that would claim dominion over our small, bright spaces in the vast darkness of the world. The candle's glow revealed the cottage's interior with gentle kindness, softening harsh edges and creating pools of golden warmth that made their simple furnishings seem rich and welcoming. The rough wooden table where they took their meals became a landscape of light and shadow. The stone hearth, where embers from the day's fire still glowed softly, seemed like an altar where warmth was worshipped with appropriate reverence. In this tender light, the family gathered for their evening meal, their faces illuminated by the flame that Martha guarded with constant attention. The bread they shared seemed more substantial, the thin soup richer, the simple act of eating together transformed into communion by the presence of light that pushed back the darkness. The candle did not merely illuminate their food, it sanctified their gathering, made sacred the simple act of sustaining life. But even as they ate, Martha's eyes never left the flame entirely. She watched for the subtle signs that warned of danger, the way the flame might lean when air currents shifted, the color changes that indicated the wick needed trimming, the speed of the wax's consumption that told her how long the light might last. Her vigilance was constant but unobtrusive, the practiced attention of someone who understood that eternal vigilance was the price of light. The wind outside was strengthening, and Martha could feel it testing the cottage's defenses. Every gap in the construction, every loose shutter, every crack around the doorframe became a potential entry point for the drafts that could extinguish their candle in an instant. She rose quietly and moved around the room, checking the cloth stuffed into gaps, adjusting the wooden shutters, ensuring that their fortress of light was as secure as human skill could make it. The candle continued its patient burning, the wax slowly pooling around the wick, the flame maintaining its steady height and color that indicated all was well. But Martha knew that this piece was temporary, that the real test would come in the hours ahead when the wind reached its full strength and the temperature dropped to the point where cold air would seek every possible way into their warm sanctuary. As the evening progressed, the family's activities arranged themselves around the precious light. William worked on repairing a tool, his weathered hands moving carefully in the candle's glow. Thomas practiced his letters on a slate, each character formed with deliberate precision in the limited illumination. Martha herself took up her mending, her needle catching glints of candlelight as it moved through fabric with the rhythm of long practice. The birth of light each evening was both miracle and challenge, both blessing and responsibility. In lighting her candle, Martha was not merely creating illumination, but accepting guardianship of something precious and fragile, something that connected her family to the eternal human struggle against darkness and cold, the flame that danced. Before them was symbol and reality, representing hope while demanding constant care, promising comfort while requiring eternal vigilance. In the deepening hours of night, when the wind outside had settled into its full strength and the cottage walls creaked under the pressure of moving air, Martha entered into the most demanding phase of her role as keeper of the flame. This was not mere watchfulness, but a state of heightened awareness that required every skill she had developed through years of practice, every instinct honed by countless nights of patient vigilance over the fragile light that meant survival for her family. The candle that had burned so steadily during the evening hours now faced its greatest test as temperatures dropped and air currents grew more active, seeking every possible way into their carefully protected space. Martha positioned herself where she could observe both the flame and the subtle indicators that warned of approaching danger. The feather that danced in drafts too gentle to feel, the wisps of smoke that revealed air movement invisible to other senses, the shadow patterns that changed with shifting atmospheric conditions. Her vigil was not passive observation, but active engagement with forces beyond her control. When the candle flame began to lean ominously toward the east, Warning of a draught from the loose stones in that wall, Martha would quietly rise and adjust the small wooden screen that protected their light from that direction. When the flame's color shifted from steady yellow to the nervous blue that indicated insufficient airflow, she would carefully move objects that might be restricting its access to oxygen. The art of flame-keeping required a delicate balance between intervention and restraint. Too much attention could be as dangerous as too little, creating air disturbances that threatened the very flame she sought to protect. Martha had learned to move with fluid grace around their precious light, her actions calculated to provide protection, without creating new hazards. Every gesture was measured, every adjustment planned to minimize risk while maximizing benefit. Young Thomas had gradually taken on the role of secondary watcher, his young eyes trained to notice changes that might escape even his mother's experienced attention. The boy understood that this was not children's play but essential family responsibility, that the light they protected represented the difference between comfort and misery, safety and danger, hope and despair. His vigil was as serious as any adult task, carried out with the gravity that befitted its importance. The sounds of the cottage at night provided another layer of information for the flame's guardians. The subtle whistle that meant air was moving through a particular gap, the soft sigh that indicated pressure changes outside, the barely audible flutter that warned of drafts approaching their candle, all became part of Martha's expanding awareness as she maintained her patient watch through the long hours of darkness. William slept more lightly than usual on nights when the wind was strong, his farmer's instincts keeping him partially alert to conditions that might threaten their home and family. Occasionally, he would wake completely, adding his presence to the vigil without need for explanation or instruction. These shared watches were conducted in comfortable silence, two people united in their determination to maintain the light that anchored their family's security. The physical demands of flame-keeping extended beyond mere watchfulness to include the subtle techniques that could coax life from a struggling flame or restore stability to a candle that had been disturbed by conditions beyond human control. Martha's hands had learned to create micro-environments around their candle, using breath and gesture to manipulate air currents on a scale measured in inches rather than feet. As the evening deepened and the wind's voice grew stronger outside their cottage walls, Martha's hands became instruments of protection, moving with unconscious grace around the precious candle that anchored their small world in light. These were not soft hands, but working hands shaped by decades of labor. Hands that knew the weight of water buckets and the texture of rough wool, the heat of bread ovens and the cold bite of winter mornings. Yet when it came to tending their flame, these calloused fingers moved with the delicacy of a master artist painting on the finest silk. The technique of flame protection was not learned from books but passed down through generations of women who had faced the same nightly challenge of keeping light alive in a world determined to extinguish it. Martha's mother had taught her to read the subtle signs that warned of danger, the way a flame would lean just before a strong draft, the color changes that indicated the wick needed attention, the particular flutter that meant air was moving, in patterns that could spell disaster for their precious light. Her cupped hands formed a natural windscreen when she moved near the candle, creating a pocket of still air that allowed the flame to burn steadily while she attended to other tasks. This was not conscious action, but instinct developed through years of practice, her body understanding the physics of air movement and flame behavior in ways that her mind could not articulate, but her hands could demonstrate perfectly. Young Thomas watched his mother's movements with the fascination of someone beginning to understand that survival often depended on skills so subtle they seemed like magic. The way she could walk past the candle without disturbing its flame, how she could work nearby without creating the dangerous drafts that might snuff out their light, the precise movements that allowed her to trim the wick without extinguishing the fire, all seemed impossible until he began to notice the careful attention behind every gesture. The cottage itself conspired against their efforts to maintain light. Built from timber and stone with the practical skills of village craftsmen, it was solid enough to provide shelter, but could never be completely sealed against the wind's persistence. Air found ways through gaps that seemed too small to matter, creating currents and drafts that turned their simple room into a complex landscape of moving air that could carry destruction to their carefully tended flame. Martha had learned to map these invisible rivers of air, understanding how wind outside translated into movement inside, knowing which weather patterns created the most dangerous conditions for maintaining light. A strong, steady wind was actually easier to defend against than the gusty, changeable air that could shift direction without warning, creating unexpected drafts that caught even experienced flame tenders by surprise. The art of shielding flame required more than just physical technique. It demanded a kind of meditation, a constant awareness of the delicate balance between protection and suffocation. Too much shielding and the flame would die from lack of oxygen. Too little, and it would be extinguished by the very air it needed to survive. Martha's hands knew this balance intimately, adjusting their position and posture in response to conditions she could sense but not always see. William had learned his own version of flame protection, his larger hands creating different but equally effective windscreens when necessity demanded his attention to the candle. His technique was less refined than his wife's, but no less effective, the result of practical necessity rather than inherited skill. When Martha was occupied with other tasks, he could maintain the light with the competence of someone who understood the consequences of failure. The family had developed wordless communication around the candle's needs, subtle signals that indicated when help was needed without the dangerous air movement that speech could create. A raised hand meant wind was shifting, and extra protection was needed. A particular gesture warned that someone was about to move in a way that might threaten the flame. These silent conversations were conducted through look and gesture, maintaining the peaceful atmosphere that seemed to help their light burn more steadily. The psychological aspects of the vigil were as challenging as the physical demands. The constant awareness that their light could be extinguished at any moment created a low-level tension that required mental discipline to manage effectively. Martha had learned to maintain alertness without anxiety, vigilance without stress, understanding that emotional turbulence could translate into physical movements that might threaten the very flame she sought to protect. The rewards of successful flamekeeping were immediate and profound. Each hour that their candle continued to burn was victory over forces that seemed determined to plunge their family into darkness. The steady light that resulted from careful tending provided not just illumination, but proof of human skill and determination, evidence that knowledge and patience could triumph over seemingly overwhelming natural forces. The techniques of patient vigil had been refined through generations of flamekeepers who had faced similar challenges and developed solutions that could be passed down through families and communities. Martha's methods combined inherited wisdom with personal innovations, creating an approach to flame protection that reflected both tradition and individual experience. She was both student and teacher, learning from those who had gone before, while developing skills that she would pass to the next generation. The cottage itself seemed to participate in the vigil, its familiar sounds and movements providing background rhythm to the night's careful watch. The settling of timbers, the gentle creak of wooden joints, the soft whisper of wind through gaps that could not be completely sealed, all became part of the environment within which the flame's protectors worked their patient magic. The animals, sheltered nearby, contributed their own presence to the night's activities, their breathing and movement creating subtle air currents that the flame keepers had to account for in their protective strategies. Even the family's old dog, sleeping by the door, could affect airflow patterns if he shifted position or stretched in his sleep. Every element of their small world had to be considered in the complex calculus of flame protection. Martha's vigil extended beyond immediate flame tending to include preparation for contingencies that might arise as the night progressed. Extra tinder was kept ready in case their candle failed and needed to be relit. Backup lighting sources were positioned for quick access if emergency illumination became necessary. Tools for flame protection were arranged within easy reach, but not so close that they might be knocked over in moments of crisis. The knowledge gained during these long watches accumulated into wisdom that served the family in countless ways beyond flame keeping. Understanding air currents helped with positioning of drying clothes and storage of materials sensitive to moisture. Awareness of temperature changes aided in planning activities and managing resources. The patience developed through hours of careful attention served them well in all aspects of their demanding daily life. As the night wore on and their candle continued its brave burning, despite all the challenges posed by wind and weather, Martha felt the deep satisfaction that came from skills well applied and responsibilities properly discharged. Her patient vigil was more than duty. It was expression of love for her family, demonstration of the human capacity to protect what was precious, proof that determination and knowledge could overcome seemingly impossible odds. The flame that danced before her, maintained through hours of careful attention and skillful protection, represented far more than mere illumination. It was symbol of hope maintained against despair, light preserved against darkness, human will triumphant over natural forces that seemed designed to defeat mortal efforts. In keeping their candle burning through the long night hours, Martha was participating in humanity's eternal struggle against the forces that would claim dominion over our small, bright spaces in the vast darkness of the world. The vigil would continue until dawn brought relief from the night's challenges until morning light made their precious candle flame less essential for immediate survival. But until that blessed moment arrived, Martha would maintain her patient watch, guardian of the light that meant so much to their small family, keeper of the flame that connected them to the ancient human tradition of making brightness in a world too often ruled by shadow and uncertainty. The tools of flame protection were simple but essential. A small metal screen, hammered from scraps of tin by the village blacksmith, could be positioned to block drafts from specific directions. Pieces of oiled cloth served as temporary windbreaks, their translucent surfaces allowing light to pass while blocking dangerous air currents. Even scraps of wood could be arranged to create sheltered spaces where the candle could burn safely, while providing maximum illumination. But the most important tool remained human hands, with their ability to respond instantly to changing conditions, to create protection exactly where it was needed, to move and adjust and adapt in ways that no static barrier could match. Martha's hands had become so sensitive to air movement that she could detect drafts before they reached the candle, positioning herself to intercept dangerous currents before they could threaten their precious light. The challenges were not merely physical, but psychological as well. The constant vigilance required to protect a candle from wind created its own stress, the awareness that a moment's inattention could plunge the family into darkness. Children had to learn not just the techniques of flame protection, but the mental discipline required to maintain attention without becoming tense to be alert without being anxious. Thomas was beginning to understand that protecting a flame was as much about understanding its nature as learning specific techniques. Fire was a living thing that responded to its environment, that had moods and preferences and weaknesses that varied with conditions. A flame that burned steadily in calm air might become nervous and unstable when wind threatened, requiring different kinds of protection and attention. The positioning of the candle itself was crucial to successful protection. Too close to a wall, and reflected air currents could create dangerous eddies. Too far from shelter, and the flame became vulnerable to drafts from multiple directions. Martha had learned through trial and error to identify the optimal locations for their precious light, the sweet spots where physics and practicality combined to offer maximum protection with minimum effort. Evening activities were planned around the candle's needs, with the most critical tasks scheduled for the periods when wind was lightest and the flame most stable. Delicate work that required steady illumination was done early, while activities that could tolerate flickering light were saved for later when protecting the flame became more challenging. The family's entire schedule bent itself around the needs of their precious light. As the night deepened and the wind's assault intensified, Martha's hands remained ready, poised to provide protection whenever it was needed. Her palms had become shields, her fingers instruments of precision, her entire being focused on the ancient human task of keeping light alive in a world of darkness. In protecting their candle's flame, she was protecting more than illumination. She was maintaining the family's connection to warmth, safety, and the ancient human victory over night's dominion. The sacred flame flickered and danced in the shifting air, but Martha's hands were there to shield it, to guide it, to ensure that the tender light that meant so much to their small world would continue to burn despite all the forces arrayed against it. In her careful protection of that fragile fire, she embodied humanity's eternal struggle against darkness, the gentle persistence that had kept light alive through countless generations of wind and storm and night. Despite all of Martha's skill and vigilance, despite the protective screens and careful positioning, despite the accumulated wisdom of generations who had fought similar battles against wind and weather, there came nights when darkness claimed its victory with the sudden finality that marked the difference between triumph and disaster in the ancient struggle between human will and natural force. The moment when their candle flame gave its last flicker and surrendered to extinction was always shocking, no matter how many times Martha had experienced it before. The silence that followed the flame's death was profound and immediate, a darkness so complete it seemed to have physical weight pressing against their eyes and skin. In the space of a heartbeat, their cottage was transformed from a warm sanctuary of light into a mysterious landscape where familiar objects became invisible. Obstacles and simple navigation required careful memory of distances and directions. The wind that had claimed victory continued its assault, whistling through gaps with what seemed like satisfaction at having extinguished their precious light. Martha's first response was always the same, a moment of stillness while her eyes began their gradual adjustment to conditions that made even the faintest star seem brilliant by comparison. She had learned not to move immediately, understanding that hasty action in complete darkness could lead to accidents that might prove more serious than the temporary loss of light. The family had practiced for such moments, developing protocols that could be followed even when vision provided no guidance. Young Thomas felt the familiar mixture of fear and excitement that came with these sudden plunges into darkness. His young imagination could transform their simple cottage into a landscape filled with mysterious shadows and hidden dangers But his practical training reminded him to remain calm and follow the procedures his parents had taught him. The boy understood that panic was more dangerous than darkness, that careful action was the key to restoring their precious light. The process of relighting their candle in complete darkness required skills that seemed almost supernatural to those who had never mastered them. Martha's hands moved with practiced certainty to the tinderbox, her fingers identifying tools by touch alone. The char cloth that would catch sparks from flint and steel was positioned by feel rather than sight, every movement guided by muscle memory developed through countless repetitions of these essential techniques. William's deeper voice provided reassurance and guidance as the family worked together to restore light to their small world. His presence was calming in the darkness, a reminder that they possessed the skills and materials necessary to reclaim their cottage from the night's temporary victory. The man's steady confidence helped his wife and son focus on the technical challenges of fire-making rather than the emotional impact of their loss. The flint and steel sang their ancient song in the darkness, sparks dancing briefly like fallen stars before disappearing into the void. Martha's breath, carefully controlled and precisely directed, coaxed the char cloth into glowing life, creating the first small victory in the campaign to reclaim their light. The embers' red glow seemed impossibly precious after the complete darkness that had claimed their cottage, a tiny sun that promised eventual triumph over night's dominion. The tinder caught with a whisper of flame that seemed loud in the profound silence, its sudden light revealing the cottage interior in flickering glimpses that made familiar objects seem strange and mysterious. Martha's face, illuminated by the growing fire, showed the concentration of someone performing sacred ritual, her attention focused entirely on the delicate process of nurturing spark into sustainable flame. The moment when the new candle caught and began its steady burning was always one of profound relief and quiet celebration. The light that bloomed in their cottage seemed brighter and more precious than before, its steady glow pushing back the darkness that had claimed temporary victory. The flame's successful establishment marked not just the restoration of illumination, but the triumph of human skill over natural forces that had seemed overwhelming just moments before. In the dim light of Martha's cottage, the small pool of melted wax gathering around the candle's base represented wealth beyond the comprehension of modern minds. Each drop was precious, saved and guarded with the devotion others might reserve for coins or jewels. For in the medieval world of Millbrook Village, wax was not merely material, but liquid treasure, every gram a testament to months of careful husbandry and patient accumulation of resources that most families could never hope to obtain. The tallow that formed their everyday candles came from the fat of animals slaughtered for food, a byproduct that transformed necessity into luxury through the alchemy of human ingenuity. But tallow burned with smoke and smell, its light uncertain and its consumption rapid. True wax, the golden substance produced by bees in their mysterious hexagonal architectures, was something else entirely, a material so valuable that even small quantities could change a family's fortunes. Martha remembered the day, 3 summers past, when the village priest had given her a small piece of beeswax in gratitude for nursing his sister through a dangerous fever. The wax had been no larger than a child's thumb, but its potential had glowed in her imagination like captured sunlight. She had debated for weeks how best to use such treasure, whether to trade it for desperately needed grain, to save it for some future emergency, or to transform it into the kind of candle that burned with steady, smokeless light. The decision to make the beeswax into candles had not been made lightly. William had argued for selling it to a merchant who occasionally passed through their village. The coins it would bring enough to purchase food for several days. But Martha had seen beyond immediate need to longer possibility, understanding that the light produced by beeswax candles could extend their productive hours, allowing evening work that might ultimately prove more valuable than the food the waxy could purchase. The process of creating beeswax candles required skills that few village women possessed, techniques passed down through generations of beekeepers and chandlers who understood the mysteries of working with nature's most perfect material. The wax had to be heated slowly and carefully, its temperature monitored with the precision of a master chef preparing a feast for royalty. Too much heat would destroy its natural properties. Too little would prevent proper mixing and molding. Young Thomas had watched his mother's careful work with the fascination of someone witnessing true magic. The golden wax, warmed and softened by gentle heat, had transformed under her hands into something that seemed to glow within a light even before it was lit. The wick, prepared with even greater care than those used for tallow candles, had been sized and positioned with mathematical precision to ensure the perfect burn rate that would neither waste the precious material nor fail to provide adequate illumination. The first lighting of their beeswax candle had been a ceremony that transcended mere practicality. The flame that emerged was different from any they had known, steadier, brighter, cleaner than the smoky flicker of their tallow lights. The scent it released was not the acrid smell of burning fat, but something sweet and pure, as if the flowers from which the bees had gathered nectar were blooming again in their simple cottage. But the true value of beeswax became apparent only as the candle burned. Where tallow flames guttered and smoked, leaving dark stains on walls and filling the air with unpleasant odors, the beeswax burned with steady radiance that seemed to purify rather than pollute the atmosphere. The light it cast was cleaner, truer, revealing colors and details that remained hidden in the uncertain illumination of lesser candles. The economic calculations surrounding their precious beeswax were complex and constant. Martha knew exactly how much the candle cost to burn each hour, could measure its consumption against the value of the work it enabled, understood the precise trade-offs between present comfort and future security. Every minute of burning represented a conscious choice to spend irreplaceable wealth in exchange for immediate benefit. But the victory came with costs that extended beyond the obvious expense of materials consumed in the relighting process. The stress of working in complete darkness, the time lost while their cottage was plunged into night, the psychological impact of defeat even when quickly overcome, all represented prices paid for the privilege of maintaining light in a world determined to extinguish it. The family would analyze what had gone wrong, examining the circumstances that had led to their flame's extinction in search of lessons that might prevent similar failures in the future. Was the wind stronger than anticipated? Had they positioned their protective screens incorrectly? Did the candle itself have some flaw that made it more vulnerable to extinction? Understanding failure was essential to improving future success. Sometimes, the cause was obvious: a sudden gust that had overwhelmed their defenses, a draft from an unexpected direction that had caught them unprepared, a moment of inattention that had allowed dangerous conditions to develop unchecked. Other times, the extinction seemed almost random, the result of factors too subtle to identify or conditions too complex to analyze with their limited understanding of atmospheric physics. The children learned valuable lessons from these moments of defeat, understanding that even the most careful preparation could not guarantee success against forces beyond human control. Thomas absorbed the importance of maintaining backup plans, of never depending entirely on a single source of light, of developing skills that could function even when primary systems failed. These were lessons that would serve him throughout his life. Martha used these failures as teaching opportunities, demonstrating the fire-making techniques that could restore light even under the most challenging conditions. The skills required to work entirely by touch, to create flame from basic materials, to maintain calm and focus under pressure. All were essential capabilities that could only be learned through practice and experience. The cottage itself seemed to settle differently after the flame was restored, as if the building had held its breath during the darkness and could now relax into its normal rhythms. The familiar sounds and movements resumed, the play of shadows began again, the sense of home and security returned, with the precious light that made their simple dwelling feel like a sanctuary rather than merely shelter. The animals that shared their compound responded to the restoration of light with subtle signs of relief, understanding that the flame represented security and warmth that extended beyond the cottage walls to encompass their small community of humans and beasts. Even their old dog seemed to breathe more easily once the candle was burning again, his instincts recognizing light as protection against dangers that lurked in complete darkness. The night's remaining hours would be spent with extra vigilance, the family's attention heightened by the reminder that their light was never secure, never guaranteed to continue burning despite all their efforts to protect it. The flame that had been restored would receive even more careful attention, as if the experience of loss had made its value more apparent and its fragility more immediate. Martha understood that these moments of defeat were part of the larger rhythm of their lives, temporary setbacks in the endless campaign to maintain light and warmth against forces that would reclaim their cottage for darkness and cold. Each failure taught lessons, each restoration proved the value of persistence, each night's vigil added to the accumulation of experience that made future successes more likely. As the new candle settled into its steady burning and the cottage regained its atmosphere of warm security, the family found comfort in the knowledge that darkness had claimed only temporary victory, that human skill and determination had once again triumphed over natural forces that seemed designed to defeat mortal efforts. The light that now illuminated their simple home was more precious for having been lost and reclaimed, brighter for having been extinguished and restored through the application of ancient knowledge and patient care. The family's activities were planned around their beeswax candle's precious light, with the most important tasks scheduled for the hours when its steady illumination would provide maximum advantage. Martha's finest needlework was done by beeswax, light, her stitches smaller and more precise than anything possible under tallow's uncertain glow. William's most delicate tool repairs were performed in the candle's steady radiance, work that might be impossible under lesser illumination. Thomas was learning to read by the light of their beeswax candle, his young eyes able to distinguish the letters carved on his slate with clarity that tallow could never provide. The knowledge he gained in those precious hours of steady light was itself an investment, education that might lift him from his family's circumstances if fortune and opportunity combined in his favor. The candle was not merely burning wax, but illuminating possibility. The preservation of every drop of melted beeswax was a sacred duty that involved the entire family. Special dishes caught the wax that pooled around the candle's base, containers that were scraped clean when the candle was moved, and the precious material saved for future use. Even the smallest droplets were recovered and preserved, understanding that accumulated waste from many candles could eventually provide material for another. The village blacksmith had crafted special tools for working with their precious wax. Small ladles for pouring melted material, precise molds for creating new candles, scrapers designed to remove every trace of wax from surfaces where it might accumulate. These tools were themselves valuable, their cost justified only by the precious nature of the material they were designed to handle. Martha had learned to judge the quality of beeswax by subtle signs that separated treasure from disappointment. The color, ranging from pale gold to deep amber, indicated the flowers from which the bees had gathered nectar. The texture, smooth and uniform in the finest grades, revealed the skill of the beekeeper who had processed it. The scent, clean and sweet without hint of smoke or impurity, promised candles that would burn with the steady radiance that made such material precious. The trade in beeswax connected their small village to networks of commerce that stretched across continents, linking their simple cottage to monasteries where learned monks maintained apiaries, to cities where wealthy merchants demanded the finest candles for their establishments, to royal courts where beeswax illumination was considered essential for proper ceremony and display. But for Martha and her family, such distant connections mattered less than the immediate reality of their precious candle burning steadily in their simple cottage. The golden light that filled their evening hours was more than illumination. It was transformation, turning their humble space into something approaching luxury, their ordinary tasks into activities worthy of royal attention. As the night progressed, and their beeswax candle continued its steady burning, Martha felt the familiar mixture of gratitude and anxiety that accompanied the use of such precious resources. Each hour of light was a gift beyond price, but each hour also brought them closer to the moment when their treasure would be exhausted and they would return to the uncertain illumination of tallow and rushes. The wax that was worth more than gold continued its slow transformation from solid to liquid to vapor, carrying with it the concentrated wealth of flowers and bees, sunshine, and patient human labor. In its burning, Martha glimpsed the profound truth that all wealth ultimately consisted of time and light transformed, that the most precious things in life were often the most ephemeral, that true luxury lay not in accumulation, but in the wise use of resources too valuable to waste. As the first pale light of dawn crept through the cracks around the wooden shutters, filtering into the cottage where Martha's family had maintained their vigil through another challenging night, the familiar ritual of morning rekindling began, with movements as practiced and essential as breathing itself. The candle that had burned so bravely through the dark hours was now a stub, its wax pooled and hardened around a wick too short to sustain much longer burning. The time had come to begin the day's light anew. Martha rose from her position near the dying flame, her body stiff from hours of watchful sitting, her eyes weary but alert to the subtle signs that indicated weather conditions and air currents had shifted with the coming dawn. The wind that had challenged their candle through the night was beginning to settle, its fierce gusts giving way to the gentler breezes that often accompanied morning's arrival. This transition period was crucial for the safe transfer of flame, from exhausted candle to fresh successor. The preparation of new candles for the day ahead was work that had been completed the previous evening, part of the constant cycle of creation and consumption that defined their relationship with artificial light. Fresh tapers, carefully dipped and shaped during the afternoon hours when natural light made such work possible, waited in their designated places for the moment when they would be called to service. Each new candle represented hours of patient labor and precious materials carefully transformed into tools for fighting darkness. Young Thomas stirred from his place by the wall, his young body more resilient than his parents', but still marked by the strain of maintaining vigilance through the long night hours. The boy understood his role in the morning ritual, his small hands useful for tasks that required delicacy and precision, He had learned to move quietly and carefully during these critical moments, understanding that haste could undo hours of successful flame tending with a single careless gesture. The technique of transferring flame from old candle to new required skills that seemed simple but demanded absolute precision in their execution. Martha lifted the fresh taper with her left hand while positioning it carefully beside the dying flame, calculating angles and distances that would allow ignition without creating dangerous drafts or disturbing the precious source of fire. Her right hand cupped around both candles, creating a still air pocket where the transfer could take place safely. The moment of ignition was always magical, regardless of how many times Martha had witnessed it before. The new wick caught with a small flare of light that seemed to dance with joy at coming to life, the flame spreading from old to new with the fluid grace of natural phenomenon perfectly controlled by human skill. The successful transfer meant continuity maintained, the promise that light would continue to serve their family through another day of challenges and opportunities. But the morning ritual extended beyond simple flame transfer to include the careful examination and preparation that would determine the new candle's chances of surviving the day ahead. Martha inspected the fresh taper with the critical eye of someone whose family's comfort depended on the quality of their light sources. The wick's length and positioning, the wax's consistency and color, the candle's overall shape and balance, all received attention that might seem excessive to those who had never depended entirely on artificial light. The positioning of the new candle required consideration of factors that would affect its burning throughout the day. Morning light streaming through their window would reduce the need for artificial illumination for several hours, allowing the candle to rest in a protected position where it could burn slowly and steadily without waste. But the location had to be chosen with awareness of how air currents would change as the day progressed and temperatures shifted. William's morning routine included checking and adjusting the protective barriers that had served them through the night, understanding that daylight hours brought different challenges that required modified defensive strategies. The gaps that had needed sealing against cold night air might require opening to allow proper ventilation. The screens that had blocked dangerous drafts would need repositioning to accommodate the changed airflow patterns that came with sunrise. Martha had learned to read the evening sky with the expertise of a scholar studying ancient texts, understanding that the clouds' formations and the wind's shifting patterns carried messages that could mean the difference between a night of peaceful candlelight and hours of desperate struggle to keep their precious flame alive. The art of weather reading was not taught in schools, but acquired through years of careful observation, paid for with countless candles extinguished by winds that arrived without warning. Standing at her cottage door, as dusk approached, Martha could see the signs that others might miss entirely. The way the bare branches of the oak tree moved in the distance told her not just the wind's current strength, but its likely direction and duration. The color of the sky to the west, where storms were born, revealed whether the night would bring steady breezes or the dangerous gusts that could defeat even the most careful flame protection. The clouds themselves were a library of weather knowledge for those who had learned to read their language. High, thin wisps spoke of distant storms that might arrive in days. Low, heavy masses promised immediate challenges that would test every technique of candle preservation. The speed of their movement across the sky calculated the timeline of approaching difficulties, allowing preparation for struggles that could be anticipated but rarely avoided entirely. Young Thomas was beginning to absorb these lessons through observation rather than formal instruction, his young eyes learning to notice the subtle shifts in light and shadow that warned of changing conditions. He had started to correlate the behavior of their animals with approaching weather changes, understanding that creatures possessed instincts that humans had to acquire through experience and attention. The direction of the wind was crucial to understanding how it would affect their cottage's interior. Martha had mapped every gap and crack in their humble dwelling, knowing which openings would channel specific wind directions into dangerous drafts inside their home. A north wind would find the loose stones in the east wall, creating currents that could extinguish candles placed in seemingly safe locations. A west wind would whistle through the gaps around the door, requiring different strategies of flame protection. The temperature drop that accompanied evening brought its own challenges as cold air sought to replace the warmer atmosphere inside their cottage. This invisible movement could create drafts more dangerous than obvious wind, subtle currents that moved with the silence of hunting cats, striking their candle flame without warning. Martha had learned to feel these temperature-driven air movements with her skin, sensing the approach of danger before it reached their precious light. The sound of wind provided another layer of information for those who had learned to interpret its language. A steady whistle spoke of consistent pressure that could be defended against with properly positioned screens and barriers. The irregular gusting that created rising and falling tones warned of unpredictable challenges that would require constant vigilance and quick responses. The ominous silence that sometimes preceded storms was perhaps most dangerous of all, the calm that allowed families to relax their guard before nature's assault began in earnest. William had developed his own weather-reading skills focused on the practical needs of protecting their animals and securing their few outdoor possessions. His observations complemented Martha's candle-focused attention, creating a family knowledge base that combined multiple perspectives into a more complete understanding of approaching conditions. Their evening conversations often included weather assessments that would determine the night's strategies for flame protection. The village itself provided clues about wind patterns and weather changes that individual cottages might miss. Smoke from other chimneys revealed air currents that would affect the entire settlement. The behavior of dogs and cats, more sensitive to atmospheric changes than humans, provided early warning of storms that might still be hours away. Even the way sound carried across the village green could indicate air pressure changes that preceded significant weather events. The old candle, reduced to its final stub but still burning gamely, would be preserved until the last possible moment of useful service. Even these final drops of wax and fragments of wick had value in a household where nothing could be wasted, where every resource had to be maximized to ensure survival through seasons of scarcity. The stub would be carefully extinguished and saved, its remains incorporated into future candles or used for emergency lighting when larger flames were impractical. The cottage itself seemed to welcome the morning renewal, its timbers and stones, releasing the accumulated smoke and moisture of the night hours as ventilation gradually improved with changing weather conditions. The gradual increase in natural light revealed details that had been hidden in the candle's limited glow, allowing inspection and maintenance activities that could only be performed when vision was adequate for precision work. Martha's morning. Examination of their living space included checking for damage that night's wind might have caused to their protective systems. Loose stones that might allow dangerous drafts, shifted barriers that no longer provided adequate protection, gaps that had opened as timber dried and contracted. All required attention before the next evening's challenges began. Prevention was always easier than emergency repair during moments of crisis. The family's breakfast preparation took advantage of the new candle's fresh light, combined with increasing natural illumination, creating optimal conditions for tasks that required good vision and steady hands. The bread that would sustain them through the day was sliced with precision, made possible by adequate lighting. The careful distribution of their precious butter and honey could be accomplished without waste when vision was clear and steady. Thomas used the morning's good light for practicing the letters that might someday lift him beyond his family's circumstances. His slate positioned to catch both natural and artificial illumination for maximum clarity. The boy understood that education was itself a form of light, knowledge that could illuminate paths out of poverty if properly cultivated and applied. His morning lessons were investments in a future that might transcend the limitations of their current existence. The ritual of morning rekindling connected their family to the larger rhythms of daily life in Millbrook Village, where other households were performing similar ceremonies of renewal and preparation. Smoke rising from cottage chimneys marked successful completion of morning fire-making. The sounds of daily activity beginning throughout the settlement provided comfort and community connection that eased the isolation of individual struggles against darkness and cold. As the morning progressed and natural light grew stronger, reducing their dependence on artificial illumination, Martha felt the familiar satisfaction that came from successfully navigating another night's challenges. The candle that now burned steadily before them represented victory over forces that had sought to claim their cottage for darkness, proof that human skill and determination could triumph over natural conditions that seemed designed to defeat mortal effort. The fresh flame that would serve them through the coming day carried within its dancing light all the hopes and dreams that sustained their family through the endless cycle of challenges and renewals that defined their existence. In the morning ritual of rekindling, they participated in humanity's eternal celebration of light, triumphant over darkness, warmth, victorious over cold, hope, persistent despite all the forces that sought to extinguish it from the world. As evening settled once again over Millbrook Village, and Martha's family gathered around their freshly lit candle for another night's vigil, the dancing flame became more than mere illumination. It transformed into storyteller, teacher, and keeper of memories that connected their simple cottage to the vast tapestry of human experience. In the gentle, wavering light that pushed back the encroaching darkness, faces took on the mysterious quality that made ordinary people seem touched by magic. Voices carried weight and resonance that daylight could never provide. The tradition of storytelling by candlelight was as old as humanity's relationship with fire, born from the understanding that flame created not just light, but atmosphere, not just illumination, but enchantment that could transform simple tales into profound experiences. Martha's mother had told stories by similar light, and her grandmother before that, each generation adding their own experiences to the accumulated wisdom that was passed down through the intimate medium of flickering flame and gathered family. Young, Thomas settled into his accustomed place near the candle, his young face eager with anticipation for the stories that would help the long evening hours pass more quickly. The boy had learned that these tales were more than entertainment. They were instruction disguised as pleasure, lessons about courage and persistence, wisdom and fullness, the complex moral landscape that he would need to navigate as he grew toward manhood. Martha's stories drew from the well of village history, local legends that had been shaped and reshaped through generations of telling until they carried the accumulated wisdom of countless lives lived in similar circumstances. Tales of harsh winters survived through community cooperation, of families who had overcome seemingly impossible challenges through ingenuity and determination, of ordinary people who had found extraordinary solutions to the problems that defined rural existence. The flickering candlelight created the perfect atmosphere for stories of mystery and wonder, its uncertain illumination allowing imagination to fill shadows with whatever forms the mind could conjure. A simple wooden bowl became a magic cauldron in the dancing light. The cottage's rough walls transformed into castle stones where knights and ladies lived their grand adventures. The most ordinary objects took on extraordinary possibilities when viewed through the lens of candle-lit imagination. William contributed his own stories to the evening's entertainment, tales gathered from his travels to market towns and his conversations with traders who brought news from distant places. His accounts of the wider world beyond their village boundaries helped the family understand their place in a larger context, connecting their small struggles to the great currents of history and human experience that flowed beyond their immediate awareness. The candle flame itself often became character in the stories, its behaviors and moods reflecting the emotional content of the tales being told. When Martha spoke of brave deeds and noble sacrifices, the flames seemed to burn taller and brighter, as if inspired by accounts of human courage. During tales of danger and uncertainty, the light would flicker nervously, its instability adding tension to already dramatic narratives. Thomas had begun contributing his own stories to the family's collection, young voice adding fresh perspectives to ancient themes. His tales often featured children who accomplished great things through cleverness rather than strength, reflecting his own hopes for the future while processing the realities of his current limitations. The boy's stories revealed his growing understanding of the world's complexities while maintaining the optimism that made difficult circumstances bearable. The technique of storytelling by candlelight required different skills than performance in full illumination, demanding voices that could carry meaning through tone and rhythm rather than depending on visual cues for effect. Martha had learned to modulate her speaking to match the flame's characteristics, understanding that gentle light called for intimate narrative styles, while brighter illumination could support more dramatic delivery. The stories served practical purposes beyond entertainment, embedding essential survival knowledge in memorable narratives that would be retained long after specific instructions might be forgotten. Tales of families who had prepared wisely for harsh winters carried lessons about resource management. Stories of communities that had helped each other through difficulties demonstrated the value of maintaining good relationships with neighbors. The candle's limited light created natural boundaries for storytelling sessions, its burning time determining how many tales could be shared before the family needed to choose between maintaining light for stories or preserving it for essential activities. This constraint added urgency to the evening's entertainment, making each story more precious because the time available for their telling was strictly limited by practical considerations. Religious stories held special place in the family's candlelight repertoire, their sacred themes enhanced by the reverent atmosphere that flamelight could provide. The tales of saints and martyrs, of divine intervention and miraculous salvation seemed more believable when told in the mysterious illumination that had been humanity's companion since the first fires were kindled in prehistoric caves. The seasonal cycle influenced the character of stories told around their evening candle, with autumn tales often focusing on harvest themes and preparation for winter's challenges. Spring stories celebrated renewal and growth, while summer narratives might explore adventure and travel that were impossible during colder months. The family's storytelling reflected the rhythms of rural life, connecting their immediate experiences to the larger patterns that governed their existence. Martha's skill as storyteller had developed through years of practice and observation, learning to read her audience's responses in the limited light and adjust her narratives accordingly. When Thomas showed signs of restlessness, she would introduce elements of action and adventure. When the family seemed particularly weary, she would choose tales of comfort and eventual triumph over adversity. The stories often served as vehicles for discussing family history and values, allowing Martha and William to share their experiences and perspectives without the directness that might seem like lecturing. Through tales of fictional characters facing similar challenges to their own, They could explore complex moral and practical questions while maintaining the entertainment value that kept their audience engaged. The memory-keeping function of their storytelling was perhaps most important of all, preserving family and community history that existed nowhere else in permanent form. Most villagers could not read or write, making oral tradition the primary method of maintaining connection to the past and ensuring that hard-won wisdom would not be lost with the passing of generations. As the evening progressed and their candle continued its steady burning, despite the challenges posed by wind and weather, the stories that filled their cottage seemed to weave themselves into the very fabric of their family life. The tales told by flickering light became part of their shared identity, creating bonds that transcended mere blood relationship to include the deeper connections forged through shared imagination and common dreams. In the gentle glow of their precious candle, surrounded by the voices of those they loved most in the world, Martha and her family participated in humanity's oldest form of entertainment and education, the simple act of sharing stories that made difficult lives bearable and connected them to the vast community of all who had ever gathered around flame to find meaning in the darkness that surrounded their small circles of light. As the seasons turned and years passed in the quiet village of Millbrook, Martha's cottage became a stage for the eternal performance that had defined human existence since the first flames were kindled in ancient caves, the dance between fire and air that determined whether families would spend their evenings in warm light or cold darkness. This was not merely a practical struggle, but a fundamental aspect of the human condition, the daily proof that life itself depended on the delicate balance between forces that could either sustain or destroy the precious illumination that made civilization possible. In her 60th year, Martha had become the village's acknowledged master of flame-keeping, sought out by younger families who struggled with the techniques that seemed so natural to her experienced hands. Her cottage had witnessed thousands of successful nights when candles burned steadily despite wind and weather, hundreds of crisis moments when quick thinking and skilled intervention had saved precious light from extinction, and the occasional defeats that reminded everyone how fragile their hold on illumination truly remained. The dance itself followed patterns that Martha had learned to read like text, understanding the subtle relationships between atmospheric pressure and flame stability, between temperature changes and air movement, between seasonal rhythms and the challenges they brought to those who depended on artificial light. She could predict with remarkable accuracy how specific weather conditions would affect candle burning, preparing defenses before problems developed into crises. Young Thomas, now a man of 27 with children of his own, had inherited his mother's gift for flame tending while developing innovations that reflected his generation's experience and understanding. The techniques he taught his own children combined Martha's traditional wisdom with modifications suited to changing conditions and improved materials that occasionally became available through trade and local craftsmanship. The cottage itself had become seasoned by decades of candlelight and firelight, its wooden beams and stone walls darkened and shaped by the accumulated smoke and heat of countless flames. The building seemed to participate in the eternal dance, its structure adapted through years of small modifications and repairs to provide optimal conditions for maintaining light against the forces that sought to extinguish it. The wind patterns that challenged their flames had become as familiar to Martha as the faces of her family members, each seasonal shift bringing predictable challenges that could be met with established techniques refined through years of practice. Yet the air never became entirely predictable, always capable of surprising even experienced flamekeepers with unexpected gusts or sudden calms that disrupted carefully planned protective strategies. The relationship between flame and air was not simply antagonistic, but complex and interdependent, each element requiring the other for its existence, while simultaneously threatening its partner's survival. Martha had learned to work with this paradox rather than against it, using air currents to feed her flames while protecting them from the same forces that provided essential oxygen for combustion. The tools and techniques of flame protection had evolved through generations of experimentation and refinement, each family adding their own innovations to the accumulated knowledge that made successful candle keeping possible. Martha's cottage contained examples of every significant development in flame-tending technology, from simple wooden screens to sophisticated arrangements of cloth and metal that could redirect airflow with scientific precision. The children who had grown up watching Martha's nightly vigils had carried their learning to other villages and distant settlements, spreading techniques that had been developed in their small cottage to communities that faced similar challenges with less accumulated wisdom. The dance of flame and air that played out in Millbrook was being performed simultaneously in countless other locations, each with its own variations, but all sharing the fundamental patterns of human struggle against darkness. The economic implications of successful flame keeping extended far beyond the immediate costs of candles and fuel, influencing everything from the productivity of evening work to the social gatherings that could be maintained through winter months. Communities where flame-tending skills were highly developed enjoyed advantages in education, craftsmanship, and social cohesion that translated into improved survival rates and higher quality of life. Martha's understanding of the eternal dance had deepened through decades of observation and practice, revealing layers of complexity that novice flamekeepers could not perceive. She had learned to read the subtle signs that indicated not just immediate conditions, but probable developments hours or even days in advance, allowing preparation for challenges that others might not anticipate until crisis was upon them. The philosophical dimensions of flamekeeping had grown more apparent to Martha with age and experience, the nightly ritual becoming meditation on the fundamental nature of existence itself. The struggle to maintain light against forces that sought to extinguish it seemed to mirror all human endeavors, the eternal effort to create meaning and beauty in a world that often appeared indifferent to human aspirations. The village priest had come to appreciate the spiritual aspects of Martha's flame tending, understanding that her nightly vigils represented a form of devotion that complemented formal religious observance. The light she maintained was not merely practical illumination, but symbol of hope preserved against despair, faith sustained despite doubt, human determination triumphant over seemingly impossible odds. The seasonal rhythms that governed the eternal dance had become deeply embedded in Martha's physical being, her body responding to atmospheric changes with the sensitivity of a living barometer. She could feel approaching storms in her bones, sense pressure changes in the subtle tensions that affected her breathing, predict wind shifts through awareness so refined it seemed supernatural to those who had not developed similar sensitivity. The legacy of Martha's flame-keeping would extend far beyond her own lifetime, carried forward by children and grandchildren who had absorbed not just techniques but attitudes that would serve them through their own decades of struggle against darkness. The wisdom accumulated in their small cottage would ripple outward through generations, influencing communities and families yet unborn. As evening settled once again over Millbrook village, and Martha prepared for another night's participation in the eternal dance, she felt the deep satisfaction that came from a life spent in service to essential human needs. The candle that would soon bloom into light under her careful attention represented far more than illumination. It was continuation of a tradition stretching back to the dawn of human consciousness, proof that individual actions could have meaning beyond their immediate practical effects. The flame that would dance before them through the night hours would write another page in the endless story of human persistence, adding its brief brightness to the accumulated light that humanity had maintained against darkness since the species began its long journey from caves to civilization. In tending their precious candle with skill and devotion, Martha and her family participated in the eternal dance that had sustained human hope through countless generations of challenge and change. The wind would blow, as it always had, seeking entry through every gap and crack in their humble cottage. The air would move according to laws of physics that remained constant despite human wishes and efforts. But the flame would burn as flames had always burned when tended with knowledge and love, pushing back the darkness that claimed dominion over too much of the world, maintaining the small, bright spaces where human life could flourish despite all the forces arrayed against it. In the eternal dance of flame and air, Martha had found her life's purpose and meaning, her nightly vigils transformed from mere necessity into sacred ritual that connected her to the vast community of all who had ever struggled to keep light alive in a world too often ruled by shadow and uncertainty. The dance would continue long after her own part in it had ended, carried forward by hands she had trained and hearts she had inspired to value the precious gift of light maintained against all odds. And as you drift towards sleep, perhaps you too can feel the comfort that comes from knowing that somewhere, in small cottages and humble homes around the world, the eternal dance continues. Human hands still shield precious flames from forces that would extinguish them, and the ancient partnership between fire and humanity burns on through the longest nights, the harshest winds, the most challenging circumstances that our shared existence can conjure. Rest now in the knowledge that light has always found a way to survive, that darkness has never claimed permanent victory, and that the gentle flames we tend with such care are connected to every other flame that has ever pushed back the night, creating brightness in the vast universe where light is rare and precious beyond all measure.